Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. We're here in docket number 2019-224E and 2019-225E. Before we broke for lunch, we were questioning witness Wintermantle. Commissioner questions were where we left off. Are there any more questions from commissioners for Mr. Wintermantle? And I've been reminded that I need to have roll call. Let's start with the commissioners present in the hearing room. Commissioners Caston, Powers, Belzer, and Jay Williams. Joining us virtually, we have Commissioners Thomas and Urban. Thank you for reminding me about roll call. All right, any more questions for witness Wintermantle? Hearing none, any redirect?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just a little bit. Good afternoon again, Mr. Wintermantle. I just want to follow up with you with a few points. Going back to what feels like a while ago at this point, you and Mr. Snowden talked about this UCAP versus ICAP method. Do you remember that conversation?
Yes, I do.
And your testimony is that you have a lot of experience doing a number of work for Southeastern utilities. I believe you named Duke, of course, but Southern Company, TVA, I believe Louisville. Is that right?
That's correct.
And based on your experience, are most of those utilities in the Southeast using the UCAP method or the ICAP method at this time?
So at this time, my knowledge is that those utilities, TVA and Southern Company, are using an ICAP.
And are you aware of any utilities in the Southeast region that are using the UCAP method?
You know, I can't say I am.
And you spoke earlier with Ms. Thompson about your testimony before the New Mexico Public Service Commission. I believe that Public Service Company of New Mexico uses UCAP. Is that right?
That's correct. They've switched, I think, this last IRP.
And do you know of any other utilities or regions in the country that use the UCAP method?
There's probably some, but off the top of my head, from a investor-owned utility perspective, I'm not aware of that accounting and treatment being used elsewhere. Yeah.
And is it? I just want to clarify: is it your testimony that that either method, if it is applied correctly, could result in reasonable or achieve reasonable results? Is that right?
Yes, I definitely think either path is a reasonable methodology. Of course, there is the E4 discrepancy here, but if it's included or not included, it kind of neutralizes any differences. But again, even those differences are going to be subtle on the big scheme of things when you think about a new CT that has a 3% E4 or 4% E4 versus a solar resource that might have a 1 to 4% E4 as well. I think overall the two methods, it's a small nuance impact any planning in my mind. I think you can get reasonable results with either one.
And my last question of this is, I understand Mr. Olson's testimony to be that the ICAP method is not compatible with ELCC and that it undervalues intermittent resources in comparison to firm resources. Do you agree with his testimony to this point?
So I think there's, it kind of just goes back to how the E4 modeling is handled in the ELCC studies. If those are a consistent methodology, I think ICAP or UCAP can work with the ELCC.
And based on the information that you have and the familiarity you have with the way that Duke uses the ICAP method, do you believe that it is reasonable?
yes, I believe the ELCCs in the planning methodology with ICAP are reasonable. You've got to think about the solar winter ELCC. We're already at very low values, so you're just not going to see much difference there. And the way we model battery in the study, they do not have E4 in the modeling, so they're producing reasonable results for capacity planning purposes.
Thank you. And switching gears a little bit, do you remember talking with Commissioner Irvin about his understanding that average temperatures are rising? I believe that was part of your conversation with him. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And I believe you also spoke with Commissioner Caston about more extreme weather and what has been seen lately with regard to extreme weather. Do you remember that as well?
Yes.
And what matters more for your purposes for a resource adequacy study or determining reserve margin? Is it the average change in temperature or the changes to extreme temperature or the experiences of extreme temperature?
It would certainly be the frequency of extreme temperatures versus average. And I think our climate change sensitivity that adjusts for average temperature, obviously didn't make much of an impact. So certainly extreme cold and those frequency of events are more important than an average increase in temperature.
Thank you. And finally, you talked with Commissioner Caston, do you remember this, about modeling the DEC and DEP systems as each as an island, and then also the concept of modeling those with assistance from neighbors. Do you remember that conversation?
Yes, I do.
And in the resource adequacy study that Astrape conducts, do you all assess the reliability of those neighboring utilities, as particularly thinking about as resource mixes are changing over time and the reasonableness of relying on neighboring utilities? Is that something that Astrape looks at in evaluating utilities' reliance on neighbors?
So, I mean, we're modeling the neighbors and we're getting them at a target reliability, but I'm not sure and we're modeling their resources as they are today and their loads as they are today. But I mean, I think to the extent that we see significant changes in these neighboring regions due to maybe more intermittent resources or energy limited resources, that could make market assistance that we rely on less or more difficult to see.
And is that something that you expect that you'll continue to evaluate in your studies going forward, particularly as utilities resource mixes are evolving as we're moving to a cleaner energy future around the country, it seems like?
Yeah, no doubt. I think, we try to put in the projections of what the solar looks like. But I know even, for instance, Dominion in their latest IRP had some major changes that increased wind and solar and other resources that are pushing them to more winter peaking. And so I think as these changes come, certainly need to incorporate them into the resource adequacy studies.
And as you just mentioned, Dominion, do you mean Dominion Virginia or Dominion Energy South Carolina? Just to clear that up for the commission.
Good point. I was talking about Dominion Virginia. Thanks for that.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Wintermantle. That's all I have in redirect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Attorney Doolin, please call your next witness.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. That concludes the company's direct case. And I believe we will move to the next or the beginning of the interveners cases in whatever order the commission pleases.
Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association, please call your first witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association's first witness is Arnie Olson.
Mr. Olson, please take the stand.
I'm here, Mr. Chairman.
Would you please raise your right hand? Mr. Olson, do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, sir?
I do.
All right, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Olson, please state your name and business address.
My name is Arnie Olson, and my address is 44 Montgomery Street, 15th floor, San Francisco, California, 94104.
Mr. Olson, for the court reporter's benefit, will you spell your first name?
Yes, it's A-R-N-E, and my last name is O-L-S-O-N.
Thank you, sir. By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I am a senior partner with the consulting firm Energy and Environmental Economics, otherwise known as E3.
Thank you. Did you cause to be prepared direct testimony consisting of 30 pages?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to that testimony?
No, I don't.
If I ask you the questions in your direct testimony again today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move Mr. Olson's direct testimony into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Olson's direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Olson, did you prepare exhibits A01, A02, and A03 to your testimony?
Yes, I did. I would just clarify that Exhibit A03 is actually, it's a company exhibit that I included in my testimony because it wasn't otherwise on the record.
All right, thank you. Do you have any changes or corrections to your exhibits?
No, I do not.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move Mr. Olson's exhibits into the record.
Mr. Olson's exhibits will be marked as, I believe, A01, 2, and 3, and entered and marked as a composite exhibit and entered into the record as hearing exhibit 15.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Olson, did you prepare a summary of your direct testimony?
Yes, I did.
Would you please give us that summary?
Yes, I would. So, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name again is Arnie Olson, and I'm a senior partner with E3. For over 25 years, I've worked extensively with utilities, government agencies, and other stakeholders in the development of integrated resource plans across North America, helping utilities to analyze the impacts of higher penetrations of variable renewable resources on their operations and investment decisions. Like utilities across the country, Duke is in the process of updating its resource planning practices and models. The world is changing rapidly, and new technologies like solar, wind, and battery storage are now playing important parts of reliable least cost resource portfolios in many places. However, these technologies are different from conventional technologies in important ways, and modeling techniques that worked well in years past when utilities were selecting a mix of baseload and peaking resources are not able to accurately consider the unique capabilities and limitations of these new technologies. While Duke has made significant progress and is far from the back of the pack when compared to its utility peers, there are still a number of improvements that can be made both in this and future IRP cycles that I discussed in my direct testimony. If you can forgive me for using a football analogy, I would note that portfolio selection in an IRP is like a coach selecting players and designing play sequences to get the most out of the available personnel. To do that well, the coach has to first have an accurate view of each player's strengths and weaknesses. And second, a sense of how the players will perform when they're on the field together. And Duke's methods fall short in both of these areas. First, Duke's planning reserve margin methodology does not result in accurate characterizations of the capacity contributions of different resource types. Duke appropriately uses the effective load carrying capability method for solar and storage, and is ahead of many utilities in doing so. However, as we've just been discussing, its use of the installed capacity or ICAP method for determining the PRM tilts the playing field in favor of conventional resources. Specifically, Duke's capacity expansion modeling in effect assumes that thermal generators are always available and never suffer from forced outages. This is like the coach using a different stopwatch for some of his players that shaves half a second off of their 40-yard dash times. Duke should use the industry best practice UCAP or unforced capacity method, which puts all resources on a level playing field. And this is a relatively simple change that could be made very quickly. Secondly, Duke's application of the ELCC methodology penalizes solar again because it doesn't appropriately consider how solar and storage perform together. Solar helps storage meet resource adequacy needs by narrowing the net peak window and providing energy for charging. Storage similarly helps solar by being available for discharge after dark and during the winter when solar doesn't perform well. Duke's methodology improperly ignores this diversity benefit when modeling solar, artificially suppressing its value in its capacity expansion modeling. This is like the coach giving all the credit on passing plays to the receiver and ignoring the importance of the quarterback. Instead, Duke should calculate ELCC values for various combinations of solar and storage and use this so-called ELCC surface in its capacity expansion modeling. Third, and most significantly, Duke's sequential modeling of solar and storage is flawed and doesn't consider economic or resource adequacy synergies between solar and storage. Solar is considered in the modeling, but without the potential benefits of storage. Storage is only considered in a subsequent phase after the solar capacity is fixed. This prevents Duke from identifying the combination of solar and storage that maximizes value for ratepayers. I recommend that Duke use a capacity expansion model that is capable of single-step optimization. That is, modeling all available resource options simultaneously. Single-step modeling captures the interactive effects of resources in various combinations, giving the coach the best view of how the team will perform when the players are all on the field together. Fourth and finally, I recommend the number of improvements to the modeling assumptions in the resource adequacy studies and ELCC study performed by Astrape Consulting. These include modeling ELCC values as a function of load rather than fixed for all time, thereby correctly capturing the impact of load growth in slowing the saturation effect of solar and storage. Modeling all future solar as single axis tracking in keeping with industry trends to better capture the increased late afternoon production from modern solar power plants. Modeling storage in preserve reliability mode to more accurately capture its highest value use in preventing blackouts during extreme peak load events. And finally, updating solar ELCC values to reflect the most recent information about wintertime demand response potential. I'd like to close by emphasizing, as I described in my testimony, how important it is for Duke and other utilities to get this right. The destructive impacts of climate change are increasingly evident, and Duke's commitment to deep carbon reductions in both the near term and long term is to be commended. At the same time, the reliability events over the past year in California and Texas have given us a stark reminder of the critical importance of resource adequacy and the consequences of failure to plan for adequate power supplies. As part of the transition to cleaner energy sources, it will also be vital for utilities and their commissions to utilize the best available modeling and operational practices to ensure the lowest possible cost for consumers, especially those who can least afford to pay. Put simply, this is the most important game of our lives, that we have to set ourselves up to win. The good news is that it is becoming increasingly apparent, that E3 and many, many others are doing around the world, that it is possible to transition to a cleaner energy system that is both reliable and affordable. Much progress has been made in terms of operational experience, expanded access to markets, and improved resource planning methodologies. I urge this commission to hold the utilities it regulates to the highest standards in each of these areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to note for the record that Mr. Olson will be returning with rebuttal testimony, and he's now available for questions from the commissioners and cross-examination.
South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Sierra Club, Natural Resources, Defense Council, Upstate Forever.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Kate Nixon, and we have no questions for this witness.
Johnson Development Associates.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Court Walsh for Johnson Development. Likewise, we don't have any questions.
Vote Solar.
Taylor Spear, Vote Solar, no questions.
Office of Regulatory Staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Andrew Bateman. No questions from ORS. Thank you.
Duke Companies.
No questions for Mr. Olson's direct testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner questions. All right. Attorney Witt, do you have anything else for this witness?
I do not, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Mr. Olson, you may step down for now. You're still under oath. You'll come back with your rebuttal, I believe, at a later time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Mr. Witt, please call your next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next witness for Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association is Kevin Lucas.
Mr. Lucas, please take the stand, sir. Mr. Lucas, please raise your right hand. Yes, sir, do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lucas, please state your full name and business address.
My name is Kevin Lucas. My business address is 1425 K Street, Washington, D.C.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I am the Senior Director of Utility Regulation and Policy at the Solar Energy Industries Association, or SEIA.
Did you cause to be prepared direct testimony consisting of 111 pages?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or corrections to that testimony?
No.
If I ask you the questions in your direct testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, before we move Mr. Lucas's direct testimony into evidence, I want to note for the record that his testimony is marked revised, but Mr. Lucas's testimony has not been revised by SEIA, but there was a reduction in the name, in the number of confidentiality redactions by the company. And that caused his testimony to be indicated as revised on April 22nd, 2021. And with that, I'd like to move his direct testimony into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Lucas's direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lucas, did you prepare exhibits KL3, KL15, KL19, and also a confidential exhibits KL8 and KL16?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your exhibits?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, we'd like to move Mr. Lucas's exhibits into the record as the next composite exhibit, with exhibits KL8 and KL16 remaining confidential as filed under seal.
All right. Attorney Witt, how many exhibits does Mr. Lucas have? Is it K1 through K?
I'm sorry. No, it's KL3, KL15, KL19, which are not confidential, and then KL8 and KL16, which are confidential.
All right, let's go through those one more time for me. KL3.
KL3, KL15, and KL19.
All right.
And then the two confidential exhibits are KL8 and KL16.
All right. KL3, KL15, KL19, KL8, and KL16 will be marked as a composite exhibit and entered into the record as hearing exhibit 16, with KL8 and KL16 remaining confidential and under seal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Lucas, you have a summary of your direct testimony?
Yes, I do.
Will you give that at this time?
Certainly. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. My name is Kevin Lucas, and I am the Senior Director of Utility Regulation and Policy at the Solar Energy Industries Association, or SEIA. I work on our state affairs team and participate in regulatory dockets across the country involving rate design, net metering, and integrated resource planning. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My testimony in this case is on behalf of the Carolina Clean Energy Business Association, or CC. My direct testimony focuses on analysis and critique of the proposed IRPs by Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy's Carolina, collectively Duke or the company. In my testimony, I analyzed Duke's 2020 Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, and its comportment with the requirements of Act 62. I compare and contrast Duke's IRP filing to the recently rejected Dominion Energy South Carolina IRP, and find Duke Energy's IRP lacking on several specific points that the Commission cited in its rejections of DSC's IRP in order number 2020-832. I also evaluate Duke's modeling approach and assumptions on solar and storage, pointing out areas where improvements are needed, and highlight the overlooked opportunity presented by the recent extension of the Federal Investment Tax Credit, or ITC, on the company's resource plan. Further, I analyze Duke's natural gas forecast, a key driver of its IRP results, and show the company's approach is flawed and must be rejected. Finally, I evaluate the benefits of broader regionalization in reducing the cost for maintaining resource adequacy and facilitating the integration of more renewable energy. This is the first IRP that Duke Energy has filed under Act 62. On its own, this fact lends increased precedential importance to this case. But because Act 62 established a new, most reasonable and prudent standard of review, the Commission's decision here becomes critical, as it will set the standard for Duke's integrated resource planning practice in South Carolina for years to come. This review comes at a crossroads for Duke. It has publicly committed to decarbonize its generation fleet by 2050. Executing on this commitment will require Duke to make large changes to its portfolio, moving it away from fossil fuel generation to renewables and energy storage. But despite this, Duke has proposed in its IRP resource portfolios that rely heavily on new natural gas power plants. It included increases in renewable energy and energy storage, but nearly all of the additions in the early years are based on already established programs and statutory requirements. It modeled portfolios that produce deeper CO2 reductions than a business-as-usual approach, but handicap their competitiveness against the base case by using unreasonable cost assumptions or relying on non-commercialized technologies. Very little in this filing is consistent with an earnest effort by Duke to push beyond the status quo towards its self-defined decarbonization goals. This is more than just unfortunate. It is incompatible with South Carolina law. Incompatible because Duke did not comply with Act 62's requirements to identify a preferred resource plan, nor provide the Commission sufficient information on which it could base its selection of such a plan. Incompatible because instead of acknowledging the challenge ahead and moving boldly and rapidly in that direction, Duke's claims that his filing is good and suitable for its marathon and not a sprint attitude. Incompatible because modeling has shown that Duke does not need to rely on gigawatts of new, risky natural gas generation, but could instead develop more renewable energy, energy, demand response, and energy storage to meet the dual goals of system reliability and customer affordability. In my direct testimony, I discuss several recommended changes, but I wish to focus on two in this summary. First, I argue the company's natural gas forecast methodology is flawed, relying too long on forward contract prices and failing to capture counterparty risk in its price forecast. Second, I challenge the company's energy storage cost assumptions as overrated. The company's natural gas forecast methodology relies on forward contract prices for 15 years before fully transitioning to a fundamentals-based model. The financial instruments on which it bases these market prices are small volume, 10-year over-the-counter swaps. Swaps are financial instruments allow one party to lock in a fixed known price for a specific duration for the physical delivery of a commodity at a specific location. This contract shifts the risk of price changes in the future to the swap party. Regardless of what the actual price of natural gas is in the future, the counterparty is obligated to deliver natural gas and only receive payment based on the price agreed to in the contract from Duke. Duke has filed this methodology in multiple dockets in North and South Carolina since 2014, despite recent orders from the North Carolina Utility Commission to not utilize swap-based pricing for more than 8 years. Duke's claim that because there are multiple brokers for swaps, that one can ignore the underlying price formation issues on these instruments fails to serve scrutiny. The monthly prices that Duke provided in discovery are practically identical to the corresponding futures curve from that same date. This makes sense as the swap prices are based on natural gas futures contracts. The prices of these future contracts are extremely volatile, changing day to day, and beyond 3 years, the market is very liquid as there is almost no trading activity. This means that the prices for years 3 through 10 of a swap are based on prices that reflect almost no trading activity in the underlying future contract market. Illiquid markets do not provide robust pricing, so even if multiple brokers are willing to trade these instruments, they are still based on prices not robustly set by a liquid market. More problematic is Duke's position that the price of its small volume swaps accurately represents a price for its entire natural gas need. I calculated that, based on the typical efficiency of a natural gas combined cycle unit, Duke's small volume 2,500 MMBtu per day swap purchases only represent a tiny fraction of 1% of Duke's annual generation and would only power roughly 15 megawatts of gas generation. I continue the discussion related to the difference between small volume and large volume swaps in my rebuttal testimony, and will return to that topic at that time. Turning to battery cost assumptions, Duke uses severely overinflated costs. Unfortunately, it claims these figures are confidential, making a public discussion of the underlying costs difficult. That said, Duke admitted its costs are higher than other public benchmarks, but claims flaws in every other benchmark to justify its figures. For instance, Duke claims that, quote, it is likely that many of the published battery costs would not be robust enough to meet the needs of the company's system, and some may not even meet the basic requirements to interconnect to the system, unquote. But the company offers no support of this very bold statement. Instead, it assumes it needs costly control software, HVAC, and fire suppression, despite offering no evidence that what is being delivered by the market today is insufficient. Duke also appears to double count costs associated with battery replenishment needed to address battery degradation that occurs over time. The annual technology baseline, or ATB, figures technology cost performance data provided by the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL, specifically include battery replenishment storage fixed O&M costs. However, Duke storage fixed O&M costs include both a standard component and a battery replenishment component, which in total substantially exceeds the NREL ATB figure. Duke also claims that it must install complex software and heightened fire suppression and HVAC equipment for its batteries. But despite including cost for these add-ons, Duke presents no support for its claim that benchmark prices like the ATB figures don't already include controls and equipments that are sufficient to safely and reliably interconnect to its grid. Duke's modeling is also deficient because it doesn't include 2-hour batteries as an available resource along with longer duration batteries. 2-hour battery resources should be limited in quantity, but they could serve a meaningful role in addressing peaky winter mornings and evenings, allowing longer duration batteries to serve more load. Together, these flaws produce battery costs that are much higher than reasonable, a flaw that the Duke proposed IRPs share with the Dominion proposed IRP that this commission recently rejected and ordered Dominion to try again, incorporating the NREL ATB figures. At the end of the day, the best option is for Duke to issue an RFI for actual battery projects built to reasonable specifications that comply with federal and state safety regulations. This will enable better price discovery rather than the confidential black box model that Duke currently uses. In short, the proposed Duke IRPs can be much better. As submitted, the IRPs do not present the most reasonable and prudent resource plan for this commission's approval. The flawed modeling methodologies, improper assumptions, and outdated renewables technology data included in Duke's proposed IRPs end up being expressed in a gas-heavy future in the Carolinas. My testimony sets out several relatively simple changes that Duke could make in its assumption and modeling, which, if adopted, would result in a more reasonable and prudent IRP that complies with the requirements of Act 62. I look forward to answering your questions.
South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Witt. I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. And Mr. Chairman, for the record, I need to note that Mr. Lucas will be returning rebuttal testimony, and he's available for questions from the commissioners and cross.
Thank you, sir. South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, Upstate Forever.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Kate Mixon, and we have no questions for Mr. Lucas at this time.
Johnson Development Associates.
Mr. Chairman, this is Court Walsh. No questions.
Vote Solar.
Taylor Spear, Vote Solar. No questions for Mr. Lucas.
Duke Companies.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Lucas. This is Brett Bryshort on behalf of the Duke Companies. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Very good. Mr. Lucas, good afternoon. I'd like to start with a few questions about your background, starting on page 1 of your testimony, if we could, please. So in your introductions and qualifications, and I think you've mentioned this in the summary, you're the Senior Director of Utility Regulation and Policy at SEIA. Is that correct?
Yes.
And SEIA is the Solar Energy Industry Association. Is that right?
Correct. Industries Association, correct.
Industries Association, excuse me, thank you. And so I'll use SEIA if that's okay with you as just an acronym to move us along here. So SEIA is a national trade association?
Correct.
Okay. And if you were to go to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, look it up, I Googled it yesterday, the definition subject to check, would you agree, would be that a trade association is an association of tradesmen, businessmen, or manufacturers in a particular trade or industry for the protection and advancement of their common interests. Do you think that's a fair definition that would appear in the Webster's dictionary?
Subject to check, that sounds like something that could appear in the dictionary, yes.
Fair enough, thank you. And so would you agree with me that SEIA's interests are focusing on advancing the common interest of the solar industry?
Yes.
All right. And on line 7 of 8 of your page 1 of your testimony, introducing your background, you say that SEIA's purpose is leading the transformation to a clean energy economy, creating the framework for solar to achieve 20% of U.S. electricity generation by 2030. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
All right. And I want to focus on the word transformation, if we could, please. So if we went back to this same dictionary and looked up the definition of transform, would you accept, subject to check, that the first entry that would come up would be to change in composition or structure?
Yes.
Okay, so is it fair to say that SEIA is focused on fundamentally changing the utility systems to advance the development of solar generation?
I think SEIA is focused on helping the utility industry broadly transition to a clean energy economy, of which solar is one piece of that. Okay, and this is, would it be between now and 2030, that's what you call the solar plus decade in your testimony? Yes, I did reference that. That's correct. That is a program that we launched, I think, about a year and change ago, that was setting a long-term 2030 goal to try to establish solar as 20% of U.S. generation. And 20% of U.S. generation, do you know ballpark how much that is? This is something that is a policy objective of SEIA? I'm sorry, when you refer to how much that is, in what context? How much? Maybe it didn't come through clearly. How much generation, how many capacity, how many megawatts of capacity that would be adding to the U.S. generation fleet? I don't know the exact figure. I believe at the end of 2020, we were, solar represented something maybe between 2 and 2.5%. And an installed capacity, I believe, a little north of gigawatts. So it would be, roughly 9 to 10 times that. So it's a substantial increase from where we are today. Okay. And so to accomplish this solar plus decade, this transformation that SEIA is advocating for, would you agree with me that would benefit SEIA's member companies that build solar projects? It would, yes, if I would say that if more solar is put on the grid, that we have member companies who would participate in that increased growth, and they would likely benefit from that.
And it is CCBA, who you're testifying on behalf of today, is it a member of SIA?
I don't believe that CCBA is technically a member of SIA. I think it's one of the local affiliate groups that we work with, but I don't know if they're technically a dues paying member.
Okay, are local solar developer members who are also members of SIA, CCBA, to your knowledge, members of SIA? So would Southern Current, for example, be a member of CCBA as well as SIA?
Without knowing exactly each company that exists in both of those associations, I believe that there are companies who are members of both associations.
So Southern Current, Cypress Creek Renewables, Pine Gate Renewables, the developers that are active in South Carolina are members of both organizations.
I believe they are, yes, that's correct.
Okay. So if we could move to lines 14 to 18 of your testimony, still on page 1. And we're not going to spend as much time on the other 110 pages, I can assure you, because that would keep us here for quite a while. But you testify that you've developed testimony and participated in regulatory proceedings, and then moving down to line 18 of your testimony, you also testify that you've performed a variety of analyses for internal and external stakeholders. Can you provide me and the commission with the examples of the types of external stakeholders that you've testified for and performed analyses for in the past?
Well, I've participated, try to think of a best way of putting this forward. So I participate in a variety of activities that SIA sponsors. We host a number of trade shows across the country. We haven't been doing that in person for the last year, but we have regional shows that have various policy panels on which I participate. Sometimes I'll have prepared an analysis to present on those policy discussions. We have groups like CCBA that are interested in certain areas, and I might do an analysis on a current rate case or a current IRP and present some information there. I also work on the team that develops white papers and content for SIA's webpage, and we put out information to our members and to the general public on issues related to solar and policy.
Okay. And in terms of your testimony for other organizations in state regulatory proceedings, is CCBA the type of entity that you would normally testify for, a state level solar advocacy group? I think this is what you perhaps addressed in your summary of your testimony. Is that consistent with your past expert testimony in other cases?
We've done testimony in different ways. Sometimes SIA individually intervenes in a case. Sometimes we work with a coalition of groups. Sometimes we work on behalf of a local affiliate, such as CCBA. So it's sort of dependent on the context in the particular location and case that we're working on.
All right. And when were you engaged for this proceeding to analyze and investigate the Duke IRPs?
I don't recall the exact date at which we decided to become involved. It was sometime probably last fall, I would guess.
Last fall. So would that have been after the companies filed their IRPs in September?
I don't remember exactly. I was aware that Duke was filing an IRP. I don't recall exactly when that filing was relative to the time that we decided that I would individually work on this case.
Okay. Did you personally, or are you aware of anyone from SIA who participated in the significant stakeholder engagement efforts that Duke undertook prior to filing its IRPs?
I don't believe I participate in that. We have regional coordinators who are a different person, a different type of employee on the state affairs team. And the regional coordinator for the Southeast would likely have been more knowledgeable and involved in those stakeholder processes.
And did you have an opportunity to review in your investigation of the company's IRPs, Mr. Snyder's direct testimony Exhibit 3, which was the ICF report that summarized the significant stakeholder engagement efforts the companies undertook as they were developing the IRPs?
It's possible that I reviewed that at some point. I don't recall specifically that document, but I reviewed a lot of documents, Case.
Okay. It's in the record, so I don't, I think it's already, it's not, I don't need to pull it up as exhibit, but Mr. Chairman, if you permit me, I'd like to post to the WebEx just briefly that exhibit.
Please identify the exhibit.
It was part of the consolidated Exhibit 1 that would have been part of Mr. Snyder's Exhibits 1 through 3. It was his ICF Exhibit 3 to his direct testimony. So it was entered in the record in support of Mr. Snyder's direct testimony.
So that's Exhibit 1?
Yes, sir. So it's already in the record to be clear.
Mm-hmm. Please proceed.
Thank you. So, Mr. Lucas, this is Snyder DEC DEP Exhibit 3, which was entered in the record as part of the consolidated hearing Exhibit 1. Were you here for that testimony yesterday?
I was in and out of the testimony yesterday, but I was here for some of it, yes.
Okay. And so would you accept, subject to check or subject to your recollection, that this summarizes the stakeholder engagement that the companies undertook prior to filing their 2020 IRPs in September of 2020?
Attorney Birchwood, would you please enlarge that document?
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm.
And is that helpful, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome. And so,
Subject to check, yes.
Subject to check. Thank you, sir. All right. So I'd like to focus just briefly on, if you will accept, subject to check, that this summarizes the stakeholder engagement and provides an extensive summary of the company's stakeholder engagement efforts. I'd like to focus on a few of this. It's difficult to see because the whole page isn't able to be presented here, but if you'll, and maybe I can scroll down to the bottom and we'll work our way back up. So this is page 5 of the exhibit. And so this section of the exhibit, if you would agree, subject to check, addresses the stakeholder feedback with the areas of most support or interest and then the Duke action taken in response. Are you able to see that?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And so the second section here, consideration should be given to additional data sources. And that's the stakeholder feedback as the companies were developing their IRP. And one area of interest to stakeholders that was discussed in the stakeholder process was the natural gas price forecasting and the consideration of additional data sources. And so the company's response is here, and it says Duke will use the EIA's 2020 annual energy outlook, high and low oil and gas supply, natural gas price curves as benchmarks to develop price curves for purposes of developing its IRPs. You've reviewed the company's natural gas price forecasting methodology and have some critiques of that in detail. Would you agree with me that the companies took this stakeholder feedback and incorporated it into their IRP?
I think in a technical way they did, but the issue is less about how that particular data source was used and more about how that data source was integrated. As I mentioned in my summary, the company did not use the EIA AEO data until beginning year 11. It used market prices exclusively from years 1 to 10, transitioned over 5 years from market prices to a fundamentals-based forecast, and then used the fundamentals forecast beginning in year 16 entirely. So the critique was less about what the other sources of the fundamentals-based forecasts were, and more about the long duration of exclusive use of the market prices.
Thank you. And we'll have a conversation about that in a minute. I just, one other section I want to point to. So this is on page 6 of the same report, and stakeholder feedback prior to the companies filing their 2020 IRPs was directing the company providing feedback to the company and input on assumptions for new technologies, especially solar storage, wind, and solar plus storage. And so one of the recommendations the companies incorporated into their 2020 IRPs was to include approximately 50% of incremental additions as solar plus storage. Would you agree with me that the companies took that stakeholder feedback and incorporated it into the analysis they developed for purposes of developing their 2020 IRPs?
I'm not sure if half the incremental solar was solar plus storage. Specifically, there was some solar plus storage that was modeled and added, but I don't know whether the model produced the 50% number that's referenced there. It also varies by portfolio in terms of the relative ratio of standalone solar and solar plus storage. But the model does produce and did add some degree of solar plus storage in the portfolios that are presented.
Okay. And in your testimony, you addressed the different types of solar that's modeled into the company's IRPs, designated, mandated, and solar that could be economically selected if it was the least cost resource based on the planning parameters of the portfolio. Is that generally correct?
I did discuss the company's designation of solar into those different categories, correct?
Right. And so the second bullet here, the feedback from stakeholders was to ensure that the model the company was using to forecast future resource needs and what types of generation could meet those needs could select additional solar and solar plus storage above the forecast. And that's something the companies incorporated into their IRPs. Would you agree with that?
Yes. So the company made a decision to basically put in a large amount of sort of the designated solar, and the model was able to select additional solar and solar plus storage on top of that. That's correct.
All right. And do you have any knowledge? Well, let me ask it this way. You, to the best of your recollection, you were not engaged in either the stakeholder process or providing any recommendations to the company before they filed their 2020 IRPs. You got involved after the companies filed their 2020 IRPs as part of this regulatory proceeding. Is that right?
To the former part, yes. I did not individually participate in the stakeholder process. I don't know exactly whether the decision for me to get involved was before or after the company's filing.
That's fair enough. Thank you. So would you agree that the companies didn't receive any recommendations from you that, or to your knowledge, CCBA, that looks similar to what's in your testimony today that they could have considered as they were developing the 2020 IRPs?
I don't have any knowledge of what CCBA did or didn't submit to this process.
Okay. Remove this exhibit. All right. Since you were engaged, whether it was prior to September 1 when the companies filed their IRPs or at some point thereafter, how much time, how many weeks would you say you spent reviewing the Duke IRPs?
I initially read through the filing in Carolina, looked through the primary IRP documents that have been put in there, the various technical appendices. I read the testimony in South Carolina, some of the additional materials, discovery, back and forth. A fair amount of time between when I began to get involved and develop testimony and continue through the process.
And did you send discovery to the companies to investigate their IRPs?
Yes, I think most of our discovery was via the Carolina proceeding, but we did have, I think, some limited discovery in South Carolina specifically, but largely my understanding is that the company and the interveners agreed that the North Carolina discovery would sort of be the venue and that we wouldn't repeat the discovery questions in South Carolina. So most of the discovery went through North Carolina.
Yeah, and I apologize for speaking over you. We might have some challenges with the back and forth over the computer, but I agree with that, and no dispute on behalf of the two companies that they agreed to allow North Carolina responses to be used in both jurisdictions. So based on that, it's fair to say you reviewed discovery sent by other parties in North Carolina that were working jointly with CCBA, such as the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association, and as well as other parties in those proceedings?
I reviewed some of it. I definitely did not review all the discovery from all the parties, but I did review the discovery that we submitted and some selected discovery from other parties as well.
Okay. And was there any information that you asked for in discovery that Duke did not provide?
There were some times early in the discovery process where the company was very delayed in responding to discovery. We would get partial responses to packets of questions, with many of the questions saying, this answer will be provided at a later date. Some of those discovery responses took multiple weeks, sometimes I think even more than a month past the actual due date of providing the information. But I think at the end of the day, the company did respond to all the inquiries, just not in the timeline that had been specified.
Fair enough. And so you don't have any reason to dispute Mr. Snyder's testimony and rebuttal exhibit that details the 3,200 pieces of data that were produced in support of these IRPs to CCBA and other parties?
I don't have anything to dispute that.
All right. And have you coordinated with any of the other parties or witnesses in developing your testimony in this case?
We've had some conversations with the North Carolina groups who are involved up there. I don't know exactly, which parties are in those coalitions versus the one in South Carolina. But it wasn't really sharing drafts of testimony and getting feedback. It was more just a general conversation about the IRP and the issues associated with that. It was the bulk of the testimony development was internal to the CCBA group.
Understood. And just returning to your work for external stakeholders and your participation in prior regulatory proceedings while at SIA in your current role, have you ever performed any analysis or done any work for a vertically integrated utility like Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress?
On behalf of a vertically integrated utility, is that the question?
You ever, and I'm sorry to speak over you, have you ever been asked to do an analysis on behalf of a regulated utility, or has your work all been advocating for the solar industry, normally adverse to the utility that's filing the certificate application or the IRP is similar to where we are in this proceeding?
I wouldn't characterize it as normally adverse to the utility, but I would say that it is. I have not prepared testimony on behalf of a vertically integrated utility.
Okay. And I seem to recall from your bio that you were a mechanical engineer was your undergraduate. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And have you I heard Mr. Wintelmantel, who's got a pretty long resume of developing studies of the power systems, saying he hasn't used that background in bio very often since he left his undergraduate institution at Alabama. So along those same lines, have you used your engineering degree or otherwise have any experience in the utility industry?
I would say I use elements of my engineering degree. I think a lot of the analytical work that I do between analyzing issues, getting to root causes, developing testimony that is of a very analytical bent, I think stems in some way from my engineering degree. I have not been a practicing engineer, and I haven't been designing physical systems to that sense, but I think there's a lot more to an engineering degree than just that aspect.
All right. And you mentioned physical systems. Let's talk about the power system. Do you have any experience operating a power system like a utility system that the DEC and DEP utilities operate?
I would say I have a working knowledge of the mechanics of the system, how they function, as well as the policy and regulations that exist around that physical system. I have not worked for a utility in the function of operating power plants.
Okay, and so did you hear Mr. Roberts' testimony yesterday?
I don't recall whether I was there for all that or not.
Well, I just so he provided his background as a system operator. When I guess my question would be, have you ever sat in the chair, so to speak, in the control room, planning to serve customers' electricity needs day ahead or balancing generation and load real time? Do you have experience in that area?
I do not.
Okay. And do you have operational experience maintaining compliance with NERC reliability standards?
I do not.
All right. And so would it be fair to say that you're not an expert on power system reliability?
I think it depends how you define that. If your narrow interpretation of being an expert means you have to have sat in the chair and done the work, as opposed to understand how those regulations impact the physical system, I think there's a distinction that can be drawn between those two things.
And will you explain to me the experience you have with the NERC reliability standards that would inform maintaining power system reliability?
I don't have specific personal experience operating a utility system in compliance with those. I do have a general understanding of the reliability requirements, how balancing areas are structured, and the operations and techniques that utilities use to manage their load flows and balance the system. I've read a number of reports that talk about how large-scale systems are modeled and operated. I have familiarity with things like the PJM marketplace and how its structure is designed. So I'd say that I have an understanding of those systems, even if I haven't actually sat in the chair and operated the actual controls that affect the physical system.
Fair enough. I'll move on to page 3 of your testimony at lines 6 through 8. You introduce a discussion where you're evaluating the company's IRPs and their comportment with the requirements of Act 62. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's what it says.
And so would you agree with me that Act 62 is a much broader piece of legislation than just the IRP section that we're focused on in this proceeding?
Yes.
Okay, and the statutory framework that the commission is operating under in this proceeding is limited to the IRP statute, which is South Carolina Code 5837-40, or I'll refer to as Section 40 of Act 62. Is that your general understanding?
That's my general understanding, yes.
And we covered your undergraduate, and just to maybe make a couple more steps here, your mechanical engineering background, you've got a master's of business administration from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, but you're not an attorney. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I think at some point in your testimony, you say you're also not purporting to be an expert on the law, not giving legal opinions. So these are more your policy views. Is that fair to say?
Correct. I'm not an attorney and I'm not giving a legal opinion, but I have over a decade of experience working in policy. I've developed testimony. I've developed statutory language. I've testified on statutory language in front of the Maryland General Assembly. I've developed and implement regulations that come out of statutory language. So I would say that I'm not an attorney, but I'm familiar with how to read and interpret statutory language.
All right. Focusing in on Section 40 of Act 62, which we're here to focus on today, and I'd be glad to put it up in front of you on the screen if that would be helpful. But would you agree with me that the word solar doesn't appear anywhere in the IRP statute?
I don't think that specific term appears from memory. Correct.
Okay. And are you aware that in other sections of Act 62, the South Carolina General Assembly was focused on creating programs to specifically promote solar, like the voluntary renewable energy program requirements, which have been approved by the commission as Duke's Green Source Advantage program, or the solar choice metering tariff provisions, which are now pending before the commission?
I am aware that there are other elements of Act 62 that talk about some of those. I haven't reviewed them in super detail to know all the ins and outs, but I'm generally aware of them.
That's fair enough. But returning back to the section that we're focused on here, there's nothing about promoting or encouraging solar as part of the IRP statute. Would you agree with that?
There's nothing specifically related to solar. I do believe that the language contains some information, specific to renewable energy, and some requirements that the company include portfolios that analyze renewable energy more broadly.
Okay. And are you familiar, and actually, Mr. Chairman, if I could, I'm going to share the IRP section of Act 62. It's the commission's preference. I don't need it as an exhibit, but if it's the commission's preference, we can certainly have it as one, but I will try to make it as big as I can so both Mr. Lucas and the commission can see it clearly.
Please do.
Thank you, sir. All right, Mr. Lucas, this is the section of the South Carolina Code we've been discussing, and I'd like to specifically focus on the considerations that the commission must take into account in developing its ultimate decision of whether or not to approve the company's IRP. Are you generally familiar with subsection, this would be C2 of the statute?
Yes.
Okay, and just I've made it bigger. I'm not changing the words at all, but it's for ease of use here. And Mr. Chairman, is this visible to you here? I've also highlighted the provisions that I'd like to speak about briefly.
Do you have it, is it a split page or do you have two boxes open?
I do have two boxes open, Mr. Chairman, but I can enlarge it if that's helpful to you. Is it just showing up on
Let's take it one page at a time if you can.
Not a problem at all, sir. All right.
And if you would not mind just citing to where you are within the statute, that will help us out here.
Yes, sir. And it looks like it moved when I, so this is subsection C2 of the statute. And I'd like to focus on subsection B, if I could, or maybe just start more generally. So would you agree with me, Mr. Lucas, that these are the A, B, C through G are the 7 factors the commission is required to consider when evaluating whether or not to approve the company's resource plans?
Mr. Chairman, Taylor Spear, Vote Solar. I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I just want Mr. Breitschwart to possibly know that there might be some work product that's appearing on the screen.
Thank you, Mr. Spear. If I could. And Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I think I'll just move on from this line of cross-examination and move on to the next area of cross. So All right, well, I apologize for the delay. Mr. Lucas, at this time, I'd like to turn to page 74 of your testimony, if I could, please.
Okay, I'm there.
All right, thank you. And on page 74, you were addressing the issue of natural gas price forecasts. That this is the discussion that we were having briefly earlier about the stakeholder engagement prior to the IRPs. And so on line 10 and line 11, this is where you're speaking of the methodology the company used in developing its natural gas price forecast. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. And you testify that despite what Duke claims in his IRP report, it's using market prices to define or influence its natural gas forecast for a full 15 years. Did I read that correctly?
That's correct.
All right. And so you cite to page 157 of the company's IRPs, or the DEC IRP at the bottom of the page. And just to clarify the record, I mean, the companies didn't misrepresent the approach to forecasting their natural gas prices in the IRPs. Isn't that correct? They didn't claim that they were limiting it 10 years. They represented that they were transitioning over a period of time to the full use of fundamental forecasts. Do you agree with that?
I'm just trying on that reference in the IRP report to confirm.
Sure, and I'd be glad to pull that up. I will hopefully be able to do that without causing any issues here. So permit me to. All right, Mr. Chairman, this has also been entered as part of the company's exhibit, I guess, consolidated exhibit 1. This is part of the DEC IRP. And so this is the discussion of fuel prices from the DEC IRP at page 157. And so, and there's a similar statement in, or Mr. Lucas, would you agree with me that this is the discussion of fuel prices from the company's IRPs that you were referring to in the footnote and in your testimony?
Yes.
Okay, and so the companies explain that they base their natural gas fuel prices on 10 years of market purchases, and then they discuss coal prices, which is not really an issue we need to focus on today. And so they explain that natural gas based on market prices were used for 2021 through 2030 before transitioning to 100% fundamental by 2035. Is that correct?
That's what that says, and you know, it's to note the 10-year, everywhere the company talks about market prices, it talks about the 10-year time period. And in fact, the financial instrument that the company purchased was a 10-year market price analysis, but it actually relied on either that or some extrapolation of those prices beyond. So I think the general, the overall approach of, or the overall intent of what I was saying there is that most of what the company speaks about in terms of market prices is on the 10-year aspect. But they, in fact, are relying on market prices and even an extrapolation of market prices that is not supported by the underlying financial mechanism through year 15 in their forecast. So yes, the company does mention that it transitions from market prices, but it is definitely relying on market prices beyond the window that it actually has market prices for.
Okay, and just to make sure the record's clear, this is what this language says, that they relied on natural gas market prices for 10 years before transitioning to fundamentals by 2035 in the last 5 years. Is that correct?
That's correct. The petition here doesn't mention the specific method of transitioning. It is linear when you look at the actual work papers, but it does reference the transition to 100% fundamentals by 2035.
Fair enough. And is it your opinion, and perhaps this is something that could be discussed in a future stakeholder process, is the company should include more discussion on its methodology for how it uses market prices and then makes that transition, recognizing that they've consistently used the same methodology, I think, as you said in your introductory comments, dating back to 2015 or 2014?
My issue is less with the extent to which the company explained it and more about the actual underlying methodology itself.
Okay. All right, well, let's turn to page 88 of your testimony, if we could please, at line 1.
I'm there.
All right, thank you. Would you please read the question that you have on line 1 through line 3?
Duke has complained in the past that fundamentals-based modeling in general and EAI's AEO in particular lag market prices and are thus ineffective in predicting prices in the near term. What is your response to this critique?
And so just for the clarifying of the record, the EIA's AEO there is the Energy Information Administration's annual energy outlook. Is that your understanding?
Correct.
I guess it's your testimony, so it would be your understanding of your testimony. So it's the fundamental forecast that you're advocating the companies adopt for a longer period of time in this proceeding. Is that right?
My actual recommendation is for the company to use an average of at least 2 fundamentals-based price modeling, one of which should be the EIA AEO, but it would use an average of at least 2 fundamentals-based forecasts.
And your answer to the question that you just read out loud is that Duke's critique that fundamentals-based forecasts are slow to react to short-term pricing is not without merit. And so it sounds like you're agreeing that the company has a point that there are lagging fundamental forecasts. Would you agree with that?
Well, the rest of the sentence says, however, the directionality of the time lag cuts both ways. So I think it is the case that fundamentals forecasts sometimes do lag the market prices, but depending on whether prices are going up or going down, there can be a difference of impact of how that actually plays out in something like an IRP modeling exercise.
Okay. And I want to turn to figure 7 that's later on this page, if you could please. Excuse me, figure 27 that's later on this page.
Yes, I see that.
So this figure was not included in the company's IRP, is that correct?
It appears from the site that this came from the North Carolina avoided cost proceedings.
Okay, and so looking to the footnote at the bottom of the page to make sure everyone's looking at what you're looking at, this is Duke Energy's, Carolina's Duke Energy Progress reply comments in E100 sub 158, which is a North Carolina avoided cost proceeding from, I guess the comments were filed March 27th of 2019. That's your citation in the testimony that you pulled this graphic from?
Correct.
Okay, so can you explain to me and to the commission why you went to the North Carolina avoided cost reply comments and pulled this graphic that's not in the company's IRPs and included it in your pre-filed direct testimony?
The company's made similar arguments in its IRP and the avoided cost proceeding to support the same natural gas forecast methodology. And this is the first IRP that has been filed under this, the Act 62. And the company had recently filed similar testimony in the North Carolina proceeding that advocated for the same natural gas forecast methodology. I made reference to testimony that was included in that docket.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, at this time, I would like to introduce an exhibit into the record, which is it is Mr. Lucas's. Give me 1 minute to make sure I've got the right PDF here. So this is DEC DEP K. Lucas Cross Exhibit 3 that was submitted to the commission. Mr. Lucas, this is a larger, more usable version of your figure 27 from page 88 of your testimony. as well as cited the company's reply comments in North Carolina. Would you accept that subject to check?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
All right, do
and
companies
I'd like-
cross exhibit 3 will be entered into the record as hearing exhibit 17.
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to walk you through this exhibit. And is it visible to the commission, the details on the page?
Yes, sir. If you could make it a little larger, it would help us.
Okay. It's a little complicated to see the full exhibit when I do that, but I'll try to do it in two halves, let's say, and we can walk through it that way. So on the left-hand side, Mr. Lucas, well, let me start at a high level. So there's two charts, and one on the left-hand side is addressing market fuel prices, and the other on the right-hand side is addressing fundamental fuel prices. Is that fair?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
Okay. And the vertical axis here is addressing the price of natural gas, and the horizontal axis is addressing the future forecast period over time. Is that starting in 2013 out through 2028 on these graphics? Is that correct?
Yes, that looks correct.
Okay. And if you can, and please let me know if this is not visible to the commission or to you, Mr. Lucas, but in this box here, it identifies the different lines that are kind of charting the data that's being presented. And so under this market fuel price example, it shows over time the various forecasts based on market pricing. And then I would move over to the fundamental forecast side. And it similarly shows the various colors of the lines from 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, so on and so forth, that are being charted as based on fundamental fuel prices. Is that?
That's what is being shown, but I would again mention, as I discussed previous, the market fuel prices that you're including in this chart are representative of small volume purchases, not representative of price that the company could potentially get for its entire natural gas supply. So while they do represent a type of market price, they necessarily are limited to reflecting the market price of that particular instrument that was purchased at that particular time.
And just to maybe take a step back, what are we solving for here, Mr. Lucas? Is it fair to say we're solving for trying to establish, both in the near term as well as in the long term, what the reasonably accurate price of natural gas is that the company can use for its generating fleets, or for this exhibit that was filed in the company's avoided cost comments in North Carolina that you've included in your testimony for establishing the avoided energy cost inputs to avoided cost rates? Is that what we're trying to solve for here?
I think there's a question about what the natural gas forecast in an IRP represents. And if it is intended to represent the price that the company could actually get or lock in or guarantee they would have over that time frame, then translating the costs from small volume swap purchases to then assume that that's the same price they would get for the entire natural gas supply of the entire company over the entire planning horizon, I don't believe that one can take that leap. I don't think that's an accurate way of translating the markets that the company has obtained for these small volumes and applying it in an IRP context that represents the entire generation fleet. So I think your question is fair, is what is the nat gas forecast supposed to represent? And if it's supposed to represent a price that the company could actually transact at, or a price that would be independent from the actions of the company's purchase of that asset, then I think the fundamentals-based forecast is more agnostic, considering the way it's been developed and derived.
And I want to bring you back to this exhibit and your testimony that we discussed earlier about the lagging nature of fundamental forecasts and the implications of that lagging nature, that they're less accurate and appropriate. And what I'd like to do is use the year 2020 as an example. Maybe first question before walking you through this. What is the spot price of natural gas today as we're here in 2021? What's the, where is the market? Where it's accurate today?
Just to correct your previous statement, I don't think I made the assertion that the lagging, the potentially lagging issue of a fundamentals forecast means it's inappropriate. That was not something that I had included in my testimony. And in fact, as I mentioned, the lagging nature of this depends on whether the prices are falling or rising. I have a chart in my testimony that actually goes back further than 2012 and looks at these trends in natural gas prices compared to the fundamentals forecasts. And there are periods of times where the fundamental forecasts were actually lower than market prices. So again, one cannot say that these are unilaterally going to produce an outcome in a certain direction. It depends on what's happening at the time. So I just wanted to make sure I was clear in terms of what I would represent in my testimony.
Fair enough, and thank you for making that clarification. You would agree with me that on page 5, on line 5 that we talked to earlier, you agreed that fundamental based forecasts are slower to react to short-term pricing trends is not without merit. So that I didn't mean to misquote you or misrepresent your testimony, but to say that another way, over the past decade, fundamental forecasts have lagged the market price. That's what you're saying. It's not without merit. You're saying that Duke's position has merit to some extent, but you have other critiques. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, and I think the time period in which you're looking at has been particularly unique in the natural gas industry, given the change in supply that's happened from fracking. I don't know if the continued nature of the rapid change in that industry is necessarily going to continue going forward, but I think during this time frame that you're focusing on, a lot of the impacts that have driven that change has been that result of the very large fundamental shift in supply in the natural gas industry, and a shift that I don't know is going to continue on a go-forward basis.
And would you agree with me that Duke Energy's objective, whether it's paying qualifying facilities, avoiding costs, or establishing the forward-looking natural gas prices that it used for integrated resource planning, the objective would be to have an accurate and appropriate forecast of what its natural gas costs are going to be out into the future? Is that what the objective should be here for the companies and the commission?
I think in general, yes. I think that one should strive for the most reasonably accurate forecast, but there's other factors that are included. You talked about Act 62. It requires sensitivities around those gas prices, so understanding how high and low variations of that forecast impacted, understanding the methodologies used to create those sensitivities. I think it also is important to recognize, the impact of the gas forecast. Excuse me, I lost my train of thought there. So yes, I think the goal is to have the most accurate forecast possible, recognizing that there are other factors. Yes, I'm sorry. An example, having proprietary forecast as opposed to publicly reviewable and available forecast. That would be another factor that I think should be included in how these forecasts are developed. But one is seeking to have the best overall, most reflective forecast for this proceeding, subject to some of those other considerations I just mentioned.
Okay, and so I asked a few minutes ago, and we got down a little bit of a side path there, but what is the market price of natural gas today in 2021?
I don't know the exact price today. I think it's somewhere
using
in the
the, and I'm sorry.
range.
Go ahead.
I think it's in the like high $2 range, mid somewhere north of $2.94 was the last price. $2.94.
All right. So using this graphic and to reorient what, would you agree with me that this graphic is trying to demonstrate what the market price is over time versus what fundamental prices were, and that $2.94 is somewhere around, let me ask you this. Can you see my cursor on the screen here?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Is my cursor generally placed around $2.94?
I would say it's probably closer to $2.80, so I would move it up a little bit.
Glad to do that.
Attorney Brett Switch.
Not trying to trick you over 10 cents here.
There you go.
Okay, so.
Attorney
so
Brett Switch.
Yes, sir.
I hate to interrupt you, but we've reached the point for our afternoon break. Do you think you could finish this witness in the next 10 minutes, or are you going to need more time?
Mr. Chairman, I would very much like to finish this exhibit and perhaps this section, and it would be a little more time than that I'd anticipate.
Okay, so
But
that's
I would say
what.
probably less than 30 minutes. So if it would be your preference to take the break now, that'd certainly be fine with me.
All right, we're in recess until 4 o'clock. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're back in docket number 2019-224E and 2019-225E. Let's take roll. Present in the hearing room are Commissioners Caston, Powers, Belzer, and Jay Williams. Joining us virtually are Commissioners Irvin and Thomas. We were on cross-examination of Mr. Lucas. Please start where you ended before we broke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Mr. Lucas, Brett Brightsport on behalf of Duke Energy. I'm going to share the exhibit that has been entered into the record that we were just speaking about a moment ago. All right, so just confirming that you can see the same exhibit we were speaking about a moment ago, and hopefully that's all you can see.
Correct.
All right, very good. So just to try to briefly recap the discussion we had a little bit ago, this is an exhibit that is reflective of your figure 27 included in your direct testimony. You had pulled this from the company's reply comments filed in an avoided cost proceeding in North Carolina in March of 2019. And we talked through the fact that it presents market fuel prices and then fundamental fuel prices over time from 2014 really through 2028. And we talked through briefly the different colorations of the lines or designating when that forward period begins, whether it starts in 2014, 15, 16, 17, or 18. Is that generally where we had gotten to in our discussion?
Yes.
Okay. And we were just getting to, I think you had said that the current market price of gas is just south of $3 to keep it high level where we are today, which obviously we're 6-8 months after the companies filed their IRPs and perhaps even longer after they benchmarked the price of gas at that point in time in 2020. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
Great. And so if you could look at the blue line, and this was assumptions from 2014, what was the assumed price of gas in 2014 if the company relied on market prices as it proposes to do in this case out 10 years? So from 2014 to 2021, and again, I'm not trying to trick you or get you to specifics, but to move this along in round numbers, what was the assumed market price of gas around 2021? Fair to say about $4?
From the 2014 numbers, yes, I'd say around $4.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. All right. So if we would go over to the fundamental price forecast, the blue line again is the 2014 assumptions. And so going out to 2021, is it fair to say that the fundamentals assumed at that point in time that the price of gas in 2021 would have been about $6?
Again, based on the timing of this forecast and based on the factors that were going on in the natural gas industry at the time, yes, that number is around $6 based on the changes that were going on at that point in time.
And I'm sorry, I spoke over you, but and again, the current market price of gas we established is ballpark $3, correct?
In that range, correct.
Okay, and so the market price, we then moved to 2015, and we look at 2021, and it was about $3.80. Is that fair?
I'm sorry, in which year?
So the red line, 2015, looking out to 2021, about here, if you can see my cursor.
Correct.
Okay, and then comparing that to the fundamental price forecast in 2021, we're still, $6 or above based on assumptions at that point in time. Is that what that shows?
Yes.
Okay, and then continuing to move forward to 2016, we're now down to $3.50, let's say. This is the green line here in the 2016 IRP as compared to ballpark, let's just say a little over $5. Is that generally accurate?
It is, but this exercise is showing that the past numbers that you're using here, which are indicative of the changes that were happening in the industry during the time these forecasts were created, is producing the distinction that you're drawing. But that's not necessarily the case for the forecast that you're using today and for forecasts going forward. So there have been periods of time when natural gas has gone up and gone down, and where fundamentals prices have been above and below market price. So I don't think that one can draw a conclusion that it is always the case that fundamentals prices are going to be higher than market-based prices in any given year. It's going to be a function of what's happening in the supply and demand of the market itself.
Understood, but would you agree with me that the fundamentals have lagged the market in this time frame, 2014 to 2018, as represented by these two graphics that you included in your direct testimony?
During that time frame, yes.
So is it fair to say that the market price was more stable and accurate during this time frame, looking out over the 10-year period for which these projections were made?
Stable in the sense of the lines are more closely together. I would give you that. I don't know the specific prices of where historical gas has been, and obviously we can't know where prices of gas is going to be in the future. So I cannot comment on the accuracy of these forecasts on any future time right now.
So let me focus on that. Your assertion is you can't make projections about what the future price of gas is going to be because we haven't gotten to the future. Is that your testimony?
No, I was responding to your assertion that the forecasts from the market prices are more accurate than the forecast from the fundamentals, and I'm saying one cannot make that determination based on this data.
Can we make it historically? If you assert that we can't make it looking ahead, can we establish that in the year 2021, the market prices as Duke projected them in 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018 were all accurate for the year 2020 and 2021, then the fundamental forecasts they would have relied on if they'd have been required to do so in those years?
I think for those 4 specific years that you mentioned, that's probably the case. I think for the later years in this forecast, they're closer, and I know exactly which one is more accurate to where prices are going to be this year. But for those first 4 years, the fundamentals forecast are above what the actual price of gas day 2020 is.
Okay, and so to say maybe what I think you just said is the more recent forecasts have caught up with the market prices and are less inaccurate than they were because they've responded to the market. Is that a fair characterization of what you just said?
I don't know if I'd say they responded to the market. I think by that point in time, the changes in supply from the changes in the natural gas industry with fracking had probably been more robustly incorporated in the fundamentals-based forecast, and so they're producing numbers that are more accurate or more consistent with each other and aren't showing that drop in year-over-year changes. But again, in terms of how accurate one versus the other is going to be on a forward-looking basis, I don't think we can say that with any certainty right now.
Okay. Let's stop sharing this. Mr. Lucas, have you reviewed Mr. Snyder's surrebuttal testimony on this topic?
Yep.
I'd like to. All right. Are you familiar? This is Mr. Snyder's surrebuttal testimony, or excuse me, I keep saying surrebuttal, but rebuttal testimony of Glenn Snyder at page 71. Are you familiar with his rebuttal figure 6?
Yes.
Okay. And so would you agree with me that this is a benchmarking of the year 2020 prices of the Henry Hub natural gas price to prior year's forecast? And the 2020 price is based on what was used to develop the IRP at the time it was developed and filed. Is that your understanding?
It is my understanding, but again, you're making a logical leap that the prices reflected in the forwards markets are same prices that the company would actually be able to secure for its entire supply over the span of the IRP planning period. And I don't stipulate to that being an accurate assessment.
Well,
So
Mr.
I would agree with you that these are reflective of forward prices, which are not the same thing as reflective of prices that the company could actually procure gas for its entire fleet over this time frame.
So before we make assumptions about what my question is, let's look backwards here, because would you agree with me? This is backward looking, benchmarking the year 2020, which has already occurred, which was the time the companies filed their IRPs. Is that what this is depicting?
Yes, that is correct. I'm sorry, I misread the initial chart there. And the next one is.
I'm gonna try to make that logical leap in a second, so not a problem for you to jump there too soon. But the NYMEX forwards, the yellow graphic here, shows what the year 2020, what the market price assumed the cost of gas would be.
Mr. Chairman, Richard Witt.
Yes, sir.
I object to going off on this discussion about something from Snyder's rebuttal after Mr. Lucas's direct.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, Mr. Snowden, Mr. Witt's co-counsel did the same thing about 2-3 hours ago. So I would submit that seems perfectly appropriate. And if Mr. Lucas has reviewed it and has an opinion on it, it would be helpful to the commission to hear it. This is not something, at least to the best of my recollection, he specifically addressed in his rebuttal testimony. And again, I'm simply following what Mr. Snowden did a couple hours ago.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think that's the basis for asking questions on something that he remembers that happened several hours ago. He should have objected.
Well,
Yeah,
if it's the commission's preference. Go ahead.
I would agree with that, Attorney Witt, and I think at some point someone objected to Mr. Snowden. So I'm not really sure what point you're trying to make, Attorney Bretschwartz. But if you could wrap it up and move on to your next line of questioning, I think that would help. I want to sustain the objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just to be clear, Mr. Chairman, I have some questions about this figure and another figure from Mr. Snyder's rebuttal testimony. If I understood your ruling as the commission's preference, that I wait to ask those questions until Mr. Lucas returns for rebuttal and not continue with this line of questioning now?
Well, it's definitely not appropriate now, and we'll have to just see what happens once you get to rebuttal.
Okay, understood. All right, well, Mr. Lucas will hopefully return to this topic later this week then. All right. I'd like to switch gears. Have you reviewed at this point the ORS reports that were filed by Kennedy and Associates in these proceedings?
I did review them at a high level, yes.
Okay, and are you familiar with Kennedy and Associates generally? Have you run across them in a regulatory proceeding before?
I don't believe I have, no.
Okay, so did you have an opportunity to review Mr. Hyatt, specifically his background and experience as part of reviewing his testimony in the ORS reports?
I'm sure I read through where he talked about his qualifications in there, but just in terms of reading their actual testimony.
Fair enough. And do you have any basis to suggest that they're not qualified to review and analyze the company's IRPs based on your review of their 100-ish page report and their backgrounds and qualifications?
No, making the observation that qualified people, some have differences of opinions. Nothing in their document led me to believe they were not qualified to offer their opinions on it.
Fair enough. And do you recall the approach that Kennedy Associates took in reviewing the company's natural gas price forecasting methodology? They essentially benchmarked it to 6 other regulated utilities and also to the 2020 EIA Advanced Energy Outlook natural gas price forecast. Do you recall that part of their report?
At a high level, I do recall them doing that. Details are not super fresh in my mind, but subject to check, I would agree with you that that's an approach that they took in this.
Okay, and do you think that's a reasonable approach to benchmark to other regulated utilities, specifically, I think it was southeastern utilities in the same market, to evaluate the reasonableness of the company's natural gas price forecast?
It is one way to do it. If I recall, though, a number of the other utilities to which they benchmarked used natural gas market prices for a much shorter period of time. And I don't remember if there's any detailed discussion around the issue that I've been talking about the appropriateness of translating the small volume prices to larger volume purchase. So I believe that a number of the other utilities used prices in the 3 to 5 year time range, and I am going from memory, but I believe that they also pointed out that none of the other ones used it for more than 5 years, and with that regard, that the companies were unusual in that respect.
Fair enough. I won't challenge the characterization that the ORS's experts suggested that the company's methodology was not necessarily 100% aligned with other southeastern utilities. But do you recall what they said about the results in terms of the reasonableness of the company's natural gas price forecast?
I feel like they said it had differences in there, but they didn't classify it as unreasonable. I don't think they said it was reasonable. I think that it was not unreasonable.
Yep, and I think would you accept, subject to check, that the kind of the culmination of their exact analysis was to say that the important question is whether DEC's and DEP's forecasts are outliers when compared to other forecasts, and the answer is no. Do you remember that discussion?
It was testimony, so I can't go into how they reached that particular conclusion. Subject to check the words that they wrote down in that thing. I would stipulate to the accuracy of what you're referring to.
Fair.
But I don't know what.
But they didn't actually. I'm sorry to speak over you there, but and to your recollection, they did not recommend any changes to the company's natural gas forecast pricing methodology or suggest the commission require any changes in this proceeding, and they recommended instead that this be something that would be discussed in a future stakeholder process between now and the next comprehensive IRP to be filed, which the company's represented they plan to do in 2022. Is that accurate?
I believe that's correct. I think they did identify a number of specific issues that they listed out as being unusual or outliers from individual context outliers from other utilities, but came to the conclusion that the companies could address those in the future. But as I discussed in my testimony, I think the time to actually remediate those issues and to address the challenges of the natural gas forecast and all the other issues that we've been talking about is in this proceeding, and not to actually to allow the companies to wait until the next proceeding to work with those changes.
Okay, and assuming that the commission disagrees with your recommendation and adopts the ORS recommendations to accept the company's natural gas price forecasts as reasonable and to engage on this topic in a future stakeholder process, do you have any reason to think that CCBA wouldn't have the opportunity to participate in that future stakeholder discussion on this issue between now and September 2022?
No, I don't. I would assume that CCBA would be able to participate in that process.
All right. I'd like to turn now to page 36 of your testimony, if you could please, sir, where you address solar and storage costs.
Okay, I'm there.
All right. And on starting on line 3, you explain how Duke developed its renewable energy capital cost assumptions. Is that correct?
Correct.
And it was based on a Navigant study that projected those costs out 10 years, 2020 through 2029. And then from 2030 forward for the last 5 years of the forecast period, they used an escalation factor that was indexed to the 2020 EIA Advanced Energy Outlook. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the methodology they use, you reference on line 7, reflects Carolina-specific factors that you identify there as labor costs and land rental. And were there any other Carolina-specific factors that you identified the companies relied upon?
I think those were largely the distinction between those. I don't know exactly what property tax assumptions are included in the nationwide averages, so it's possible that property taxes and sales tax applicability to solar could also factor in, but I don't specifically recall one way or the other on how those factored in.
Okay, and did you hear Mr. Columba's testimony this morning where he was articulating that there were differences even, and perhaps it's obvious, property taxes that affect solar projects between North Carolina and South Carolina, and so that could affect the economics of the projects between the two jurisdictions?
I do recall that.
Okay, and so based on even within the company's service territory between North Carolina and South Carolina, the importance of regional specific factors being taken into account. Do you think those are important considerations to include when you're analyzing the cost of new technologies that are being developed, like solar?
Yes, I think that's, yes, I would agree with that.
All right. And turning to the next Q&A you have there, on lines 10 through 12, you generally suggest that the companies utilize this regional specific data rather than the NREL ATB's general nationwide averages, and the result for the solar cost, project cost, capital cost is results in lower costs associated with doing business in the Carolinas. Is that your testimony?
Yes, that's my understanding of part of the reason why Duke's numbers for the capital costs were lower than the nationwide averages.
And you found those capital costs when you focused on these Carolina-specific factors to be reasonable. Is that right?
For yes, for the standalone solar that I'm discussing here, correct.
Okay. And did you evaluate for other technologies similar localized region-specific factors versus relying on national averages?
I don't recall. I mean, the other main category of project or of technology that I analyzed was storage costs. And I believe in that one, the company did not point out the local versus national averages as being one of the factors that were included. It had a number of other adjustments to its the benchmarks that it utilized. And so I believe I went into more detail on those factors as opposed to the changes in local costs as opposed. But I would note that at least for the solar costs, they ended up resulting in lower costs than the benchmarks, where the company's battery costs had adjustments that ended up making them substantially higher than the nationwide benchmarks.
And would you agree that it's appropriate to focus on Duke's actual local Carolina-specific cost assumption versus general nationwide averages of costs?
I think it's appropriate to consider that. I believe that I also recommended in terms of the storage cost in particular, since there was a lot of debate about the characteristics of the actual system as opposed to simply the capital costs of its system, that the company could put out an RFI to collect more actual market intelligence from the local market to inform its costs there. the solar cost assumptions that we're talking about here, there was not a discussion on the characteristic of the system and whether you should have, you know, higher or lower inverter load ratings, or you should use, you know, higher or lower cost panels in a way that there was on the energy storage. So I think that the use of local cost information is important in a solar piece, but a different set of characteristics was coming out in the discussion around the storage costs. And yes, I think ultimately if the company put out an RFI for actual projects in the area, they would get bids that are reflective of the local costs in their jurisdictions, which would be a good starting point for their cost projections.
And those RFI assumptions could be included in future resource plans?
I think that they would inform the near-term price. So as the company certainly knows, it constructed its forecast of storage cards by a starting price, which it used and calculated sort of a bottom-up and then applied a discount factor over time that reflected technology changes and other changes as well. So I think calibrating the costs in the initial year and then using a sort of industry-wide benchmark of cost decline is an appropriate way of developing that forecast.
Okay. If you turn to page 43 of your testimony for me, please, sir. And now I would like to briefly talk through some of your critiques of the company's battery storage cost assumptions. Looking at line 16, you discuss your criticism, and I think you called the company's calculation of battery replacement costs, the methodology irrational and flawed. Is that it seems to be your testimony there?
This specifically with the storage assumptions in the Solar Plus Storage project, and as company witness Kambala discussed this morning, they have moved to a replenishment strategy in the standalone storage, which I believe is the more appropriate way of doing it. By comparison, in the Solar Plus Storage project technology, the company went with the overbuild methodology, which was contrary to what witness Kambala recommended on this. So in my sense, going with the overbuild is a poorer choice than going with the replenishment strategy. And I'm unclear why the company chose one for its standalone storage projects and the other for its paired solar projects.
Okay. Well, and focusing in on that, so one of your critiques is that the company assumed that halfway through the useful life of the project, the 30-year useful life, they would have to replace the battery. Is that correct?
I think I said that it was a mistake to assume that 100% of the battery pack must be replaced at zero value. I didn't include at zero value in that sentence, but I believe I talked about there being some potential residual value for that battery, which the company did not include in as a cost offset.
And so this is projections today looking out in the future. And I think you made the comment a little while ago that we can't know what's going to happen in the future. So we're making assumptions. When we were talking about natural gas price forecast, do you recall that testimony?
Well, yes, and the company is making assumptions on a number of things in this case in the future, both in terms of natural gas and technology costs.
I would agree with that. And how many batteries co-located with storage how many batteries co-located with solar generating facilities exist today that are have been in operation for 15 years?
I would guess very few. There could be some initial research ones that were done, but this was not a broadly utilized technology 15 years ago to have been installed at that point.
Yep. So 20 years or 30 years, there's less to none is probably fair to say.
Very few, if any, correct.
Right. And so as utilities likely don't have operational experience constructing the solar plus storage assets or knowing what their operational characteristics will be or how much residual value will be in that battery 15 years from now, based on the fact that they've not had that experience today. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair with respect to utilities. It certainly is the case that batteries themselves have been around for more than 15 years, and there have absolutely been research done on degradation rates of the technologies that underlie that. I believe that there are research papers that show how much capacity would be left in a battery after a certain number of time. So I think that the company's assumption that the value is zero is incorrect. Whether the value should be X dollars higher or Y dollars higher, I don't know. But I think including a price of zero for that offset is beyond just a conservative estimate. It would assume that you would literally, throw the thing away even if it had useful value in some other function.
But you'd agree with me that would be reasonable as the companies continue to learn about battery storage technology and continue with this resource planning process under Act 62, that they would continue to study the issue and update assumptions over time, and take the learnings that you've identified and incorporate them into future IRPs, correct?
In general, I think that's an appropriate process, but I think the company probably could have found some data or some research that suggested some degree of residual capability of the battery and found out, what some non-zero price could be. I think the company's approach was, conservative in the sense that it applied a zero value to something that may have value. But I agree with the rest of your sentiment that the company should continue to learn, not only from its own operations, but from the operations of other utilities that perhaps have begun down this path a little earlier than the company.
Mr. Lucas, thank you. That's all the questions I have this time.
Thank you.
Office of Regulatory Staff. Attorney Bateman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Andrew Bateman with ORS. No questions for this witness.
Commissioner, questions for this witness? Commissioner Caston.
Good afternoon, Mr. Lucas.
Good afternoon.
Earlier, I think, it's been so long ago, when the discussion, or maybe it was when you were providing your summary, did I understand relative to battery or storage, were you suggesting, or did I understand that Duke should send out, I guess, requests for cost or proposals for cost or whatever for batteries or storage to get a more, I guess, accurate or realistic value? Did I understand that, or did I just absolutely miss it?
No, Commissioner, you're correct. I think I formally made that comment in my SIR rebuttal testimony, but in discussing it here, one of the challenges with getting the prices and looking at different benchmarks is the discussion that we just had, is understanding what the actual local conditions are. And the way the company produced its forecast is it had sort of a starting point and then had a decline in price over time that was sort of reflective of where the industry was going. This is the same way that the NREL numbers that I referenced did their analysis. They have a starting point that is based on a sort of bottoms-up analysis of the cost of a system, and then they apply a decline over time based on industry learnings. So my recommendation to go out to the market and issue an RFI to say, hey, I'd like to install a battery of this size, of this duration, in these locations to serve these purposes, and to make sure it has characteristic A, B, and C. And a lot of the discussion that we had about whether the company needs to install more sophisticated power controls is one example. I would posit that the industry already uses batteries that are capable of being operated in the way the company would need them to operate. So putting additional in their model for that functionality is probably not something that is justified in the market. So yes, I think going out to the market, asking for bids on what it would actually cost to install a battery of a certain characteristic in these locations would help inform the costs on a forward basis.
So do you believe then that, and I don't remember the years off the top of my head, but somewhere in the future, if Duke companies solicit bids for future storage, I guess for future years, 10 years out, 15 years out, 20 years out, whatever. Do you believe that they would receive bids from battery storage companies for that far out?
No, sir, and I apologize if I wasn't clear. My thought with regard to the RFI was to get near-term pricing for projects that would be installed in the near term. The purpose of which, in the context of the IRP, is to make sure that the modeling inputs that are being used that go into modeling the system over the planning period start with the most robust data possible. Because as I discussed and as future witnesses will discuss, the assumptions that you put in the model have a big impact on what the model produces as being a reasonable portfolio. And because the commission is charged with determining what the most reasonable and prudent plan is, starting out with assumptions that are too high storage may result in the model not selecting as much storage, and therefore the portfolio that's presented to the commission for approval may not be reflective of the most accurate data. It's absolutely the case that in the future, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whenever that may be, when the company goes out and has an approved IRP and has a plan and is building towards that plan, they would issue RFPs at that time to get prices reflective of in that future. But the RFI idea was simply to inform that starting point of the battery costs for the modeling exercise. And it would not be to, for example, get a real project that would be coming online in 2030. It would be get a real project that could be installed in the next 18 months to 2 years and get pricing information on that.
Okay, so I understand you're saying that inputs matter.
Correct, very much so.
And I guess this can be another question, perhaps later in rebuttal. Whatever values the Duke companies used is, I guess, what you're questioning. But if I understood, right now the witness escapes me, I'll think of it later, that they also assumed, I think, a 50% reduction in the value of that storage. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I recall that discussion. And I think that those declines, as I mentioned, there's sort of two ways of getting at this. There's where do you start the projection, which you can either benchmark on publicly available data, such as the NREL ATB. You can benchmark it on sort of a third-party confidential model from, for example, from Navigant, which is what the company did. Or you could go out to market and say, hey, participants in this market, what will it cost to build a battery of this type? All of those are setting that initial price. And then from there, the cost line over time is largely a function of how the industry itself grows and matures. And technology and economies of scale develop that drive the cost declines over time.
Okay. I guess along the lines of inputs matter as I think about it, because I do not know anything about this model or the model that they use. But I think in terms of inputs, and through the course of this hearing and perhaps others, I've heard numerous, I guess, references to maybe some western states, northern states, and not saying they're good or bad, I don't know. But when I think about trying to develop, the most accurate model, at least relative to inputs, and I know you've, I think, answered this with Mr. Breitschwart, but when it comes to looking at those inputs and looking at values and such as that, do you do you believe that looking at some of these values from the western states or northern states is a better input than looking at the southeast region, or what the maybe utilities, investor-owned electric utilities in this region do or use?
I agree with you that those local factors are very important. So in the discussion that I just had with Mr. Breitschwartz, the distinction between the capital costs, where they had used local factors that affected things like labor, property tax, and so on, land rental, that impact the cost that go into the solar project. I agree that those are important things to consider and incorporate. And the RFI idea that I mentioned, even though I found the company's solar prices to be reasonable, there's no reason that they couldn't also do something along those lines to figure out what the price in the Carolinas could be. So I think that idea of incorporating the local variability is important. And I agree that you would not want to simply take the capital cost from a bid in another state and just generically apply it in this area. And I don't believe the company did not do that with respect to solar. I don't recall any discussion from the company about those adjustments in the battery costs. I think the battery cost discussion, as I mentioned, was more about the characteristics of the battery and the functionality of the battery, as opposed to the local factors that go in there.
Okay. And one final thing too, on page 6 of your, I think, direct testimony, down around line 10 and below, where you talk about items related to Act 62, because as I read through them and made notes some time back, I think line 14, where you say Duke should select a single portfolio as its most reasonable and prudent option, and then you say Duke should use battery costs from NREL's ATB. But are you saying that these are specific requirements of Act 62, or these are just your opinions?
These are my opinions.
Okay. And you say that Duke should select a single portfolio as its most reasonable and prudent option. Now, why do you say that?
So that was based on my reading of the language in Act 62, that the Act requires the Commission to approve the most reasonable and prudent plan. And in my view of that, the way the company presented its plan was the combination of the 6 portfolios, and suggesting that the 6 portfolios together encompass their plan, and the Commission should approve that plan as being the most reasonable and prudent approach. But a plan that has 6 different options, that has very different assumptions embedded in them, that has a number of sensitivities on things like fuel costs, on things like load forecasts, on efficiency, and so on. I just don't understand how that comports with the direction for the Commission to approve the most reasonable and prudent plan. So in my interpretation of this and the arguments I made, the company should select a plan that it puts forth as a recommendation for the most reasonable and prudent, and the Commission can then approve or not approve that. Or absent that specific approach, the company needs to provide the Commission with sufficient information for the Commission to make that decision. And I also argued in my testimony that there were factors that were lacking. For example, the company's risk analysis and risk assessment associated with its portfolios, in my view, was not robust enough for the Commission to make that determination about which of the 6 portfolios is the most reasonable and prudent plan. So my first recommendation is the company would put forward that, but absent the company doing that, the Commission needs to have sufficient information to make that determination on its own. And I don't believe the company has provided that information to the Commission.
I'm assuming you're referring to Section C2 in the Act, is that correct?
That is correct.
Commission shall approve an electric utilities integrated resource plan if the commission determines the proposed integrated resource plan represents the most reasonable and prudent means of meeting the electric utilities, energy, and capacity needs, and so on. So you interpret that as saying that they should select a plan.
Right, and I think to continue that, the energies and capacity needs at the time the plan is reviewed. So that goes to my critique about the company delaying the incorporation of all these changes to either a future IRP or to the future or to the IRP update in the fall. My interpretation of this is the utility needs to present a plan to the commission that it deems to be the most reasonable and prudent, and the commission can approve that, shall approve it if it finds it passes the balancing test listed in A through G. But I don't believe that a portfolio of six different portfolios, a plan composed of 6 different portfolios, can meet the literal definition of a proposed integrated resource plan, singular noun. And for something to be the most reasonable and prudent means, that sort of implies it's one thing. So whether the company presents it or the commission chooses it, I believe there needs to be a specific and specified plan that is based on a set of input assumptions that produces a portfolio that the commission determines is the most reasonable and prudent, and that should be the path that goes forward. I mean, the company's presentation of 6 different plans is not a direction, and if the commission were to approve that, it's unclear which of those 6 plans the commission feels the company should pursue. So that's sort of why I'm reading this as a singular. And again, whether it's the company offering that or whether it's the commission approving it, it needs to be based on the information at the time the plan was reviewed, which is in this proceeding.
Well, then, do you agree that section B1 is a list of, well, do you agree that section B1 in essence says what the integrated resource plan shall include?
It shall, yes, it includes all the following, and the list is there, including things like different forecast assumptions, investments on transmission, different portfolios that test various supply sides. Yes, I agree that there are multiple portfolios that the company should have and did construct. But again, I view that the approval of the most reasonable and prudent plan necessitates a specific direction. And I don't think that having a plan of a variety of options, some of which, as you saw, contain very, very different outcomes, both from a cost standpoint and from a technology standpoint and from a risk standpoint. And I think that it's appropriate for the commission to pick a particular direction for the company to send them on their path and say, this is the approved plan that we want you to follow, and begin to take actions based on that.
Okay, then do you agree in those A through I, none of those specifically say that after you do all these things, select a plan?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think that the company has made a sort of tacit recommendation of its base case without carbon. I'm recalling a discovery response that didn't go as far to say it was the most reasonable prudent, but it was sort of the most appropriate plan. But they did not explicitly make that the case that it was putting forward as the most reasonable and prudent. So again, whether that determination is made by the company or made by the commission, I do think it's important that it reflects an actual actionable path that the company can take, as opposed to a variety of different paths and different futures.
I understand. I mean, I can't speak for anyone but myself, but, I want to make sure to the best of my ability and understanding that I follow what the law says rather than do things by fiat. But I understand what you're saying, and I must say, you have been very calm, great demeanor, patient, and you've been up there for a long, long time. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Any more questions for this witness? Commissioner
Yes,
Irvin?
Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Lucas, I've enjoyed hearing you testify, and I think I agree with Commissioner Caston. I think you've hit on an important point that Act 62 does require that we select a plan. It's not a multiple choice situation. We have to look at all costs and benefits and weigh out what's best for South Carolina. Do you agree?
Yes, Commissioner. I apologize. I'm getting some sort of weird distortion in your voice. I believe you followed the chain of your questioning. And I don't know if it was just me who's getting that issue or other folks as well. But I believe to your point, yes, I agree with you that it should not be a multiple choice approach, and that a more specific direction needs to be determined out of this proceeding.
And taking that to the next step, I agree with Commissioner Caston that the best way forward is to ask the company to rank their recommendations and then let us evaluate the ranking and determine if we rank 62 their first choice. Would you agree with that approach?
And I would go a step further, and I would say that in order for the company to determine what the most reasonable and prudent plan, that plan has to be based on valid assumptions. So as we said earlier, the inputs matter, and the recommended changes that I'm suggesting in my testimony, I would recommend that those be incorporated in this and see how a portfolio is determined based on that. And some of the risk assessments that the company has not performed would be performed in order to produce the complete body of information that the commission needs to make that distinction.
That's right. I've done a little research in cost projections for utility scale battery storage, and I came across a study by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Are you familiar with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory?
Yes, I am.
Do you believe that it's a reliable source?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, I was pleased to learn at the end of this report that they actually have ranked, they have a map for the entire United States, and they have what they call a capital cost multiplier for solar batteries. And believe it or not, Duke Energy Carolinas is ranked as the lowest cost area in the nation for taking into consideration the value range. The value range runs from 0.948 to 1.11.
Commissioner Irvin,
Yes, sir.
I hate to interrupt you, but that distortion is causing us not to fully understand your line of questioning. Do you think it's possible for you to call in on your phone?
Certainly. If you give me a call-in number, and I need a access code as well.
We're sending you one now, sir.
All right. You're going to send it to my laptop so I can continue. Had some problems with my signal today. It's coming and going. Received an email yet. Laptop. That's where I prefer it, so I can call in.
Yes, sir. We're trying to get it together. We're in recess until 5:10.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're back in dockets number 2019-224E and 2019-225E. We'll take roll. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioners Caston, Powers, Belzer, and Jay Williams. Joining us virtually, we have Commissioners Thomas and Irvin. Before we broke, we were with Commissioner Irvin with questions for the witness. Commissioner Irvin. Commissioner Irvin, I believe you're muted.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was asking you earlier if you recognize the National Renewable Energy Laboratory as a reliable, incredible source of cost projections for utility scale battery storage. Do you?
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. And so they did an initial report in 2016 and updated in 2018, which have been about the time this IRP was drafted. And one of the things I found interesting was they, at the end of the report, which you can find online, by the way, at nrel.gov. That's nrel.gov. You want to follow along. But at the end of the report, they indicated that there were regional cost multipliers. And I found it interesting that the northwestern part of South Carolina is the cheapest area in the entire country to purchase battery storage. You know that?
I don't know if I was specifically familiar with that result. I'm aware of those cost multipliers that you're referring to, but I have not looked at the Carolinas.
And I'm not sure, you know, why that would be, but it's good news because I would hope and suspect that that trend would carry forward. But specifically, I wanted to ask you about a couple of things as it relates to your testimony. Did you understand my question when I said that I agreed with you and Commissioner Caston that this is not a multiple choice question, that Act 62 does require us to settle on a plan? You agree with that?
I do, yes.
All right, sir. And we have to weigh the cost and benefits under Act 62 to settle on what the best plan is for our state. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
And there are a number of factors that have to be taken into consideration. And those are outlined in Act 62 as well. You agree?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And so what I'd like to ask you about is if we assume that the cost of battery storage is falling, and has been falling rather dramatically over the last few years, does that bode well for including it in the South Carolina IRP?
Yes, I think it does. And one thing that I think we'll hear from a future witness, Rachel Wilson of Synapse, she performed some alternative modeling that looked at the impact of making some of the changes that we discussed in my testimony. And among those results is that additional battery storage is economically selected by the model and produces a portfolio that is lower in carbon, is lower in cost by a substantial amount, and continues to serve all the load that's in the period. So yes, the fact that battery prices are falling bodes well for its inclusion in a future portfolio.
And so is it fair to characterize that scenario going forward as a win-win?
I think it would, if we can figure out a way to get a reliable portfolio that is less expensive for Duke's customers. That also helps create jobs and reduce carbon emissions. I think that's great all around.
It's also great for ratepayers because as you know, South Carolina is a relatively poor state. I think about a third of our population, if not more, is living under the federal poverty line. And we know that the pandemic has impacted them in an even greater way in terms of loss of jobs and loss of habitat and being able to put food on the table. So we have to be mindful of costs, but we also want to be mindful of benefits. Would you agree with that?
I would completely agree with that. And I think Ms. Wilson's modeling showed about $7.2 billion in cost reductions by using the portfolio she developed. So that would absolutely help Duke's customers and its ratepayers.
So cheaper is not always better. You agree with that?
I think having a reliable system is table stakes. You can't produce a system that can't reliably deliver power. But in that context, once you establish a portfolio that does, as the alternate portfolio does, then having less expensive power is beneficial.
Right. Now, you testified earlier about natural gas prices, and you know, the bottom line is really nobody knows what's going to happen going forward. Nobody would can tell us exactly what's going to happen with natural gas prices. Would you agree with that?
I think that's correct. Yes, the future on that is not knowable.
It's murky because, for example, if the current administration decides to place, and they haven't yet, but if they decided to place limits on fracking, that would have a big impact on prices, would it not?
It certainly could, yes.
And the recovery of the economy is things pick up now, and you know, we've gotten somewhat past the COVID crisis, and people are getting back to work. Inflationary pressure could raise prices too, couldn't it?
It could, yes.
So we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. Do you agree with that?
I would agree with that, and that's one of the benefits of renewable energy is you simply do not have fuel costs. The sun is and will remain free.
And it's really an important principle is to have a diversified portfolio. Would you agree with me on that principle?
I do, yes.
Yes, sir. So in terms of going forward, most investor-owned utilities, and to Duke's credit, they've led the way in deciding that coal is not the answer. And so they have been closing and retiring coal plants, which is a good thing. And to Duke's credit, they have also engaged their stakeholders in a detailed process and giving them input and consideration, which is also a good thing. So they're doing some really great things. They're leaders in moving toward a renewable economy that is sustainable. Would you agree with that?
I think they have taken some positive steps in that direction. Their long-term goals are in the right direction. I think I would argue that they could probably pursue those actions and activities a little bit quicker. But yes, they certainly are moving in the right direction.
Compared to their peers in the industry, they're doing better than most. Would you agree?
I'm not familiar with all the peers in the industry. I'm aware of some utilities that are perhaps moving a little faster, but I'm definitely aware of some utilities who are moving slower. Right.
And so we have to give them credit for trying. And I think that they have the skill and the tools to do it. But the fact of the matter is we have to get it right. We really don't have many chances given the time frame we're looking at in terms of trying to reduce CO2 and methane emissions and all the problems that brings along with it. Would you agree?
I would agree, yes.
Now, would you also agree that the solar industry can bring a lot of benefits to the system?
Yes, I do.
And that would include rooftop solar as well, wouldn't it? Because while we kind of overlook that sometimes, it does make the customer-generated distributed energy does help in a lot of ways to address the problem. Would you agree?
I do agree, yes.
And so we want to try to give them an opportunity to continue to survive, even though we've got some folks that scream about a cost shift or a subsidy. We want them to continue to be viable because they're part of the solution. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, I'd be interested in knowing, do the members of your association, are they in the business of manufacturing solar storage batteries, or are they just selling them, or both?
We have members who span the entire industry, from manufacturing to financing to project development to project operations, to turnkey installation to rooftop installers. Anyone who's involved in the solar industry at any level is eligible to be a member of our company or of our trade association, and we have members representing all of those different sectors.
And so you may have heard my suggestion earlier that if you put out a request for proposal and had a bid process where all of your members and the utilities involved could bid on a request for proposal to provide battery storage, for example, is that being done in any other jurisdictions to your knowledge?
There definitely are procurement processes that come out of an IRP process. I'm actually starting up a case in Colorado now where Excel, which owns PSCO in the Denver area, they have a process where they do an IRP, and then once they establish a need from that IRP, they issue an RFP and they go out to market and have a procurement for the resources. There's a process in Michigan where Consumers Energy put forward an IRP that did not add any new fossil plants and instead proposed to add more efficiency and renewable energy. That plan was approved, and the company has, out of that plan, had a series of RFPs for solar and solar plus storage and wind projects and efficiency projects as well. So there is a process in a number of different places where they do the plan, they identify the need, and then they have subsequent procurements that are informed by that need.
What advantages do you see to proceeding in that fashion?
Well, I think on first level, having competition for these resources is critical. I testify in my staff had some comments, and I responded in a rebuttal about just including the option for a power purchase agreement in the model, which the company does not agree with. So I think having that competition both at the modeling stage as well as at the procurement stage is vital. And I think having appropriate, rules around the participation on what the utility can and can't do in those procurements is also important to make sure that everybody who's participating has a fair ability to bid on and win projects. But I think introducing that competitive angle is absolutely critical.
And of course, the company would have the opportunity and the responsibility to set the parameters of the project. For example, they could issue specifications that are going to be bid upon, correct?
Yes, they can certainly specify what type of capacity they need. There's different approaches to that. In some jurisdictions, a third-party administrator would actually set up the rules of the just to sort of take away any potential issue of having the utility set its own rules.
Right.
But yes, the utility would certainly be involved, and they would ultimately have to integrate these the winning bids into their grid, so they have to be comfortable with how they're specified in that process.
And there are third-party providers that offer those professional independent services for procurement. Correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Well, I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I appreciate your testimony today, and I have no further questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Any more questions for this witness? All right, redirect.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, but we don't have any redirect for witness Lucas.
All right, Mr. Lucas, you can. Did I hear someone? Okay, I'm hearing phantom voices. Sorry about that. Mr. Lucas, you may step down for now. You're still under oath.
Thank you, sir.
All right, Mr. Witt, will you please call your next witness?
That was our last witness, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right. So next up, we have South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Sierra Club, Natural Resources, Defense Council, and Upstate Forever.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is Kate Mixon. Before we proceed, I just wanted to quickly note, we had planned to put up two witnesses at this stage, James Wilson and then Jim Gravatt, to present their direct and rebuttal testimony together. James Wilson had some unexpected scheduling conflicts this evening, so we would ask whether the commission and other parties are amenable to us switching that order and putting up Jim Gravatt now, and then James Wilson as the first witness tomorrow morning.
All right. Is Mr. Wilson available tomorrow morning?
Yes, he is.
All right. Now, remind me, there are some witnesses who are not available. Is it on Thursday or is it tomorrow?
We had some witnesses for our the rebuttal stage of testimony who would be unavailable sometimes tomorrow and then on Friday. But again, we were planning to present them at the rebuttal stage, so we're waiting to see whether those conflicts actually arose or not.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, this is Andrew Bateman with ORS. I think it's possible you may be thinking of the two ORS witnesses who have a conflict with testifying tomorrow as a result of a hearing in Kentucky. That would be ORS witness Barron and ORS witness Collin.
Okay. You're right. So, Barron and Collin. So tomorrow we have a commission business meeting that may take an hour or so. If we get through Mr. Wilson, how do you pronounce that, Attorney Mixon? Gravatt?
Jim Gravatt.
Gravatt.
He is available this evening. Although if
will he not be available tomorrow?
He will be available tomorrow. If we I guess don't put him up this evening, then we would have James Wilson testify prior to him tomorrow, which was our original plan.
Right. So tomorrow, Wilson, Gravatt, Tyler Fitch, and Sandonado and Hyatt, if we're lucky. We can only hope. All right, that's what it looks like we will handle tomorrow. We reached a good stopping point for today. We will start with South Carolina Coastal Conservation League et al. Presenting their case tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We're in recess until 9 a.m.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.